as you can imagine, one of the ongoing issues or areas of exploration that we generally work on is the intersection of religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity. It's work that we've been doing for as long as I've been at Tanenbaum, and that's 16 years, and our work has evolved over that time. But it never stops being an area of both interest and exploration, and certainly not one that does not need attention. I think I'm just going to let our panelists speak for themselves, but both as someone who identifies in a number of these areas, the thing that I'm very glad that we have been doing at Tanenbaum has been to break down the stereotype of the idea of these isolated identities. That your sexual orientation is somehow so distinct from your racial or ethnic background and so distinct from your religious background that we work in false narratives that people who are religious are only heterosexual, and people who identify as other than heterosexual are not religious. And that kind of becomes the foundation for a lot of bad programming and a lot of misunderstanding, miscommunication, and bias. So with that, my new best friend from across the water, Gurchaten Sandhu, you're in Switzerland right now, correct?
Indeed I am. It's very wet and cold at the moment.
It's wet and cold here in New York as well.
That's
we don't need that, like, a global rainstorm, because that's the next thing we need, right? Could you talk a little bit about just the overall work that you do at ILGA World, and in particular, how is your work contributing to, or what are you seeing for businesses in particular to address with the issues that you're tracking and exploring?
Thank you very much. Thank you for that question, and thank you to Tanenbaum for inviting ILGA World here in this event. Let me just want to congratulate you, Mark, on that very opening remarks, because as a person of color, a person of faith, and a person who's queer, being in these forums is very, very important, and being on those intersections of holding multiple identities. So on an individual note, thank you very much for raising this issue, that we don't just live in silos, and it's not just, people of religion or people of faith in one corner and queer people in another. So ILGA is the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association. We are a global federation made up of 1,800 membership organizations from around 70 plus countries, covering 6 ILGA regions. Our tagline is Queer Democracy in Action. The tagline I use, because I used to work in the UN, is that we're the LGBTI version of the UN system. We bring together organizations working on LGBTI issues, or LGBTI organizations and civil society together to develop consensus and convene them to develop a global voice to do advocacy at the global and regional level, and as well as support change at the grassroots level. Of course, we have very diverging views in our communities and our membership. We don't always have one. We don't live in a monolith. And it's very important that we bring our communities in these spaces where we have a global conference every 3 years and elect our new board, as well as ensuring the programmatic work of the organization. Now, we work, the office in particular, or the organization has 6 regions that it covers. We have offices in ILGA Asia, Pan-Africa ILGA Europe, which is one of the largest regions that we have, ILGA Oceania, ILGA Latin America and the Caribbean, and ILGA North America and the Caribbean. And in fact, we've only just established our office in North America and the Caribbean. It's one of the last regions, believe it or not. Our membership in the North American Caribbean is one of the fewest in comparison to the rest of the world. So in terms of our work, what do we do? Just to give you a quick taster of what we do is we're famously known for our research around state-sponsored homophobia. So which countries criminalize? Many of you would have heard up until recently, 68 countries criminalize on same-sex acts. That figure, we are the official source of that figure. And that figure comes from us. It's now 64. So we produced this tool called the State-Sponsored Homophobia Report, which came out every year with an annual update. It was so good and so popular, we decided to get rid of it and replace it with something called the ILGA World database. So for all of your guests in the room and online, I encourage you to check out the ILGA website, which is www.ilga.org. And if you can click on the database, there you will see up-to-date information on key areas of legislation, including freedom of association, right to same-sex marriage, partnership adoption, discrimination at work, as well as what is going on in the UN. That's our primary, that was one of our streams of work. What we also do is a lot of what we call advocacy in multilateral spaces. We come in to the UN system and across the UN system to advocate for the inclusion of SOGI or sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics into UN political resolutions, programmatic work, policy, so that and the way that we do that is ensuring that our organizations, our members, are given space and access to those spaces where they can advocate for their rights at the national level. So that could be through providing shadow reports on what we call UN Universal Periodic Reviews. It could be engaging with special treaty bodies. It could be engaging with special mandate holders, such as the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. So what we do is that our job is to bring those voices closer to the UN, because often we think of this UN as a thing in the sky and we can't reach it, we can't access it, but we're there to sort of facilitate that. So that's ILGA World in a crux, and we do other work as well as our advocacy around the intersections around faith, sports, religion, and age. As well as other issues around trans and human rights. So just very quickly, in terms of when it comes to faith, the current conversations, what we're seeing is the rise of what is called the anti-rights movement. And a lot of the anti-rights movement, and what we're seeing and evidence quite rightly points to, is that this is not the origins of this are primarily from the West. The anti-rights movements have re-emerged in parts of Western Europe, in North America, and have spread and disseminated hate across the world and globally, and picking up on very poignant arguments and weaponizing, even to some extent, a working class of people to say we are safeguarding and protectors of women, we are safeguarding protectors of children and youth. So they're they're opting for such narratives which can be very, very divisive, and they have equipped a global voice, or they've weaponized the most the most marginalized populations against one another, including the working class. So we see, again, like I said, the origins of this are in the US, but these actors are not just divisive against gender, but they're divisive. It's the same actors that are at play here against faith as well, against race. So what these actors are doing right now is taking up what our old colonial masters did in the past, was using a narrative of divide and rule. So, and it's undermining, and what they're doing is undermining the very systems that have been created to protect the most marginalized, and in fact, protect most of us, and that's democracy. So what we're seeing is that it's not just an attack on LGBTI people, it's not just an attack on Muslims or on Jewish people, it's not just an attack on people of color or women, it's an attack on democracy. So what we need to do is strengthen our resolve to ensure that democracy is hard, it's difficult, it takes up time, it's bureaucratic, but we must ensure that we remain faithful to it, to ensure that even the most marginalized have a voice. Because what will happen is that once you take those voices away from them, other voices will be next. And we see that happening, where we see LGBTI actors are the same people when we saw Wade versus Roe being pushed out. Now we're seeing that being used, and we've seen the arguments being used to take away LGBTI rights in other areas as well. And this is not just happening in the US. This is a wave that is now being spread across the Atlantic and the Pacific into other countries as well. And what is even more concerning is that where the narrative is being flipped to say you're colonializing us with LGBTI rights from the West. In fact, that's not the case. So it's what we're getting into is that the same language that we have used for progressive movements and decolonialization is now being used against us in those spaces too. Thank you.
Gurchaten, thank you so much. And I just want to highlight one thing that you said, because I don't think that language has quite reached the US or the Americas, the idea of an anti-rights movement. That it's not just the individual actions that are taking place, but it is actually an overall attempt to undo democracy, and that each of them are related. And I really appreciate you raising the idea of how language that was used and fundamental concepts that were used to seek equity are actually now being used as evidence as to why we should remove those kinds of protections and remove that inclusion. So it's definitely something I think is important for all of us to be mindful of when we hear language like that, to contextualize it in perhaps a different way than we normally would. Thank you so much for that first introductory bit. Oh, yes.
Just wanted to add to that, and I think it's very important. We see an example of that now, where we use certain terminology to use progressive language, and we see the same words being used against us in some cases. So we know that some member states, like in the UN governments, the UN member states know that gender and what it means, and they know what diversity means, and they push back on it to the point that some UN entities or specialized agencies will say, where they're now being forced to take out words like gender, diversity, and it's becoming harmful. We're now also seeing member states use language like fair play in international sporting advocacy, and it's not just about what language is being used, but who is saying what, who is behind those words, and we must take into account, because it can get there's a lot of manipulation there behind it for adverse reasons, where what we're doing is trying to advance the issues with that language. What is happening on this sort of polarity is that language is being used or co-opted for the opposite effects. Thank you.
Thank you. So Jane, my friend, tell us about the focus of Out Leadership now. And one of the things, for those of you who may not know, Out Leadership, are you 13 years old now or 14?
It's hard to tell, but yes, I think 14. Yeah.
And there have been a number of newer initiatives over the last couple of years. So in addition to everything else, I'd love for you to just punctuate some of the newer initiatives in terms of working with companies around LGBTQ equity and inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say, if Gurchaten is your new best friend, I certainly better be your old best friend.
You are my old best friend. You are my old best friend.
And I will keep my intro on what Out Leadership does fairly brief, because I feel like we're already getting to the good bits. So, but Out Leadership is the largest and oldest LGBTQ business network focused directly on the intersection of LGBTQ equality and business opportunity. So both from the perspective of internal employee engagement policy, all the way from folks' first day on the job to the board. I see some familiar faces in the audience, and I'm sure virtually from our member organizations, but really this idea of how are you engaging internally for your employees and then externally for your stakeholders, clients, on LGBTQ plus issues. And so our focus is really on that talent life cycle, and then how to to use the soft power of business to advocate for equality everywhere. So Gurchaten was talking about the 64 countries where it's still illegal to be LGBTQ. Our member companies operate in all of those. And so really, how can we be using the soft power? And I think something that I wanted to build off of that you ended with, Gurchaten, and you were talking about, Mark, is really this idea of we're talking about language, we're talking about the ways in which we've seen pushback around these concepts of diversity, of gender equity, from a socio-political perspective. And I think what we have seen is that the power that multinational organizations have is just staying consistent with values. And there's so much power in that, because no matter how the tide turns, the pendulum swings, you feel pushed from both sides all around the world. Multinational organizations have this great power in being able to say, we hear you, we see you, we understand we have to navigate the political landscape in all of the places that we operate, but we have global values that we will be consistent with. And I think that's something that's been giving me hope as we've been seeing things ebb and flow. In terms of who I am, why I'm here, other than being Mark's oldest best friend, is I'm our Managing Director of Research and Programs, so I'll try to sprinkle in a little bit of data, but really in terms of kind of what we're seeing in the conversations around this intersection. The other hat that I have on, and our founder and CEO, Todd, had Mark Fowler be my very first call 4 years ago when I started at Al Leadership, because on my resume, he saw that I have my master's in theology and ministry. So as your lesbian theologian on the stage, I'll certainly bring that lens to the conversation, and specifically as we think about the workplace and holding these multitude of identities.
Yes, so oldest and dearest friend.
Yeah. I was going to say 16 years that you've been here. You were 8 years old when you started. It's astounding.
I was 8 years old. At least that's what my plastic surgeon says. And thank you. I want to pick up right where you left off, which is this whole idea of what are you actually seeing at the intersection of sexual orientation, gender identity, and religion as it relates to some of the efforts that you are already engaging in with member companies?
Yeah, I think the thing that we try to punctuate is not just what was said earlier about, obviously there are queer people who are people of faith, and people of faith are not necessarily homophobic or transphobic. I think that it's extremely important to name those things as organizations and as leaders in this space. But it's also that these communities are not automatically against each other. I think that by setting up conversations in that way, you're starting at a disservice. And so making sure, finding ways, I think what we see across diverse communities in organizations is silos, right? That are ERGs focused on Asian folks are not collaborating with the women's ERG, or the LGBTQ ERG is not collaborating with the different religious ERGs and with people of faith. And the more that we can center these conversations as not distinctly separate, but in fact quite integrated, the better that we do. And I think not being afraid to have some of those stickier conversations. We more recently had a conversation around hate speech and brought in folks from multiple religious identity groups as well as LGBTQ plus folks to have that conversation, understanding that sometimes the hate speech, the othering is happening from one another, and naming those things to then be able to start having the more meaningful conversations around, okay, yes, but how do we make sure that the workplace is a safe place for both me and you, no matter what our held identities are? And how can we encourage folks to understand you may have held beliefs, but that does not justify othering, hate, and certainly that those things at their intersection have great impact on not just individuals and kind of the humanity that we all hold, but also on your businesses. When we're talking about recruitment, when we're talking about primarily retention, these things have huge amounts of impact.
Thank you so much. And I just want to punctuate one of the things that you said. So, I think everybody here knows one of our competencies for respectful communication, and I think the bread and butter of both the workplace program and several of our programs, is this idea of managing behavior and not belief. And that is going to become far more critical in the days to come, because what we're asking employees to do, what you're asking employees to do, is to manage the behavior that comes out of the beliefs that they have. That there is an expectation of you fill in that blank from your mission, from your values, from your stated objectives around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. But you do have to take that pause to kind of put your feet on the ground and remember, kind of like, okay, so this is who we say we are as a workplace. And there are feelings that you have, there are beliefs that you have, and the expectation is that your behavior is going to be in line with our code of conduct and with our values as a company or an organization. And I think that's and it's interesting because people ask me if I see a lot of resistance to people talking about religion in the workplace. And the truth of the matter is, by the time somebody gets to us, they've made a decision in one way or another. They've made a decision that religion is something that at least must be explored. They got to figure something out. But the issue becomes, people seem to be far more reticent to talk about religion just as an idea and a part of identity than other facets of identity. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that we are far more segregated than we would like to admit when it comes to religious belief, practice, understanding, education. And yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add one thing is I think that there's this fear in naming. When you start the conversation naming, many religious groups are perpetuators of some of the greatest hate that certain communities feel, not just the LGBTQ community, and vice versa, right? Folks who have felt that oppression, let's say, obviously from my perspective as a member of the LGBTQ community, sometimes it can be easy to other folks who have strong religious beliefs that I know may see me in a negative light. And so by naming those things up front, I think people are afraid to do so because it's scary. But if you do it, you then can start the conversation.
Yeah, I think that, and Gurchaten, I'm coming to you now because I think context is decisive, right? It always is. Context is decisive. Content contributes through context, and we can't get that confused. So, Gurchaten, we often talk about there's the proximity and the immediacy of the intersection of sexual orientation, gender identity, and religion. But many of you are operating global corporations with multilateral relationships. So, Gurchaten, I wonder if you could talk a little bit in terms of the work that you've done, particularly with workplaces. How are they managing those intersections, and any things that you see that might be interesting, either trends or differences in different regions of the world?
That is a very, very, very good question, and a very difficult question. And I think, yeah. Let me go back to the World Cup Qatar, where ILGA World was working closely with many different partners on ensuring that, Qatar bid for the World Cup. We all have opinions on whether, how transparent it was. And, now there are rumors around Saudi Arabia bidding for the World Cup in 2030 and 2034. So, and I'm sure there's going to be more conversations around this, but we won't comment today on the transparency of that process. Nevertheless, we came up against a lot of challenges, or a lot of the questions around a lot of businesses who are engaging and sponsors of the World Cup, the Men's Football World Cup, working in Qatar. How do we do this? How do we sponsor this? One, and stay true to our values, what can we do to ensure that we are maintaining principles of equality, equity, and non-discrimination as a sponsor of the game? What can we do to help you access spaces? So there was a lot of conversations there on this, and the impact of that. And our approach was very, very simple: do no harm. So make sure when you are working or operating in these areas that your approach is a do no harm approach. And by do no harm, are you consulting with the right actors? Are you consulting with the right voices? Are you reaching out to a diverse group of representatives from our communities? Now, in a community, in a country like Qatar, not everyone is going to be hi, I belong to the LGBTI community. So this is where we come in, where we can facilitate that dialogue and ensure that dialogue was happening between members of the LGBTI community, both in Qatar and externally as well. So we had numerous dialogues around this and numerous webinars to help businesses around Qatar, as well as issuing statements, using not just to issue a blanket statement against the Qatari government because it can have impacts on the local population, but using us and saying, okay, what do you think of this statement? We want to do this, or what can we do? And some companies then reached out and said, okay, can we provide sponsorship to you to help XYZ community here do this? Those were great ways of sort of still ensuring that your principles and values will be upheld. And I think, then businesses have a lot of power into then having negotiations and talks with those governments as well. We all saw what happened to blessed Budweiser as well. Didn't plan all of that beer. What are we going to do? So they had all of those conversations with the government, and they had access to channels and corridors of power, which our communities, and including ourselves, we don't always have. So how are you taking us into the room and facilitating that dialogue for us to then have that conversation? So I think Qatar was a great example of doing that as well. So I think that was the biggest, that was a concrete example there. So I think in terms of the navigating of this, then we had the Qatar case, but then more closer to home in the USA, we had the whole issue of Budweiser, where they had a very famous trans person promoting their beer, and then suddenly, criticism, and then they decided to drop that, their ambassador, or that I forget Dylan. Someone will have to remind me of the name.
Dylan Mulvaney.
Yeah, Dylan Mulvaney. So they decided to drop them as an ambassador, and then that has repercussions for our community. And that says, right, where was there any consultation behind that? And I'm sure, I do hope that Budweiser was conducting that consultation. And then there are other cases of businesses trying to do their very best in ensuring that intersection happens as well. But and it's not just in those regions. I think looking at Asia as well, in Indonesia, Philippines, in Saudi, where we have governments, authoritarian regimes, where businesses are working with governments, with authoritarian regimes. How are you ensuring that we have access to those access to those governments to hold those negotiations and hold them accountable as well?
That's great. Thank you so much. So we only have about 5 minutes, more like 2.5. So,
did I hear 6?
Please let there be bidding so that we can stay and talk some more. I guess with the few minutes that we have left, what I'd like to ask both of you just to opine on is, given what you're seeing and where we are at this particular moment at the intersection of religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, what do you think is the critical issue for companies to be prepared to address?
I promised data, so I'll bring some data. And I actually want to see if folks can guess. I'll keep it so fast. if you were to guess what the number one reason that folks aren't out in the workplace is, what would you guess? Quick, we only have a short amount of time. Come on. Retaliation. What else? One more. Continued employment. So the number one reason is the fear of making others uncomfortable. And I think that, and that's globally, 10,000 folks surveyed all around the world, consistently that's the answer, is the fear of making others uncomfortable, which of course can lead to, those things are underneath that umbrella, I would imagine. But I think that what we ask is that organizations think about that stat in all of the decisions they make for the community. And I think that when we're talking about the intersection of religion and LGBTQ plus folks is actually an incredibly helpful stat. Because what you're telling people is you don't have to sign someone's engagement card, you don't have to go to their wedding, but you do have to make them feel human and seen. And I think that is that's an easier conversation to start in environments where it's difficult to have these conversations. And I think what the last thing that I'll say is that it has to be modeled from the top. We talk to a lot of our organizations. We have two of them who support our board diversity work the most actually here today, so thank you. But is the conversations have to not just be manager to low-level employee, but they have to be having these conversations across the board. Because when we see the most pervasive corporate allyship and allyship across the board for every marginalized community, it's when those conversations are happening top down and bottom up. And so I think that's where I would leave folks.
Thanks, Jane. And Gurchaten, what's the one thing that you think that companies should be preparing for at the intersection of religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity?
I think I already mentioned one example last was to ensuring access to channels of power, and that doesn't necessarily happen. It has to be with government, but also with leaders of faith as well. We saw a very good example. Open for Business. Open for Business is a network based in the U.S., much similar to our leadership in the US. Open for Business is more on the European side, where Open for Business were able to set up a meeting with the Vatican, with their business leaders, and what they did was they opened it up to ILGA World, where our co-secretaries were able to then go to the Vatican and address and talk to high authorities within the meeting was supposed to be with the Pope himself, but I think it was the number two there. I excuse my ignorance. That was a good example of how business can operate. Number two, I would say not just channels of power, but being prepared to be held accountable. A recent study just showed that certain governments, including the one where you're based now, have actually funded far-right wing groups and faith-based groups which are acting adversely against the LGBTI community in parts of East and West Africa. Okay, the evidence is there. We've found it. Okay? And we're now saying to those governments, you have to be held accountable. You're countering, on one side, you're countering the anti-rights movement and anti-LGBTI movement, but at the same time, you're funding it. What is it? Now, I think businesses have to be prepared for that themselves, and it's already happened. I think there was a famous case in the US where a telecommunications company was found to be funding, or their leaders or members of the board were found to be funding far-right evangelical groups within the US, which have a known record of so making sure that your board members, that your companies, and when you're doing pro bono work, when you're doing corporate social responsibility, engaging with communities, you're not actually doing harm. And that those that you are working with, that you have done your due diligence as well. And it's vital. Thank you.
So, Gurchaten, thank you so much for joining us virtually. The next time we hope that it's in person, that we'll be able to bring you across the sea. My oldest best friend, Jane, thank you both for sharing your expertise, your resources, and your wisdom. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.